In Mixpanel Insights reports, understanding user behaviors based off of the uniques, the totals, the frequency, and the aggregate is interesting. But you know what's more interesting? Breaking down by properties that are common to users. And this is especially interesting when you start to ask more detailed questions to understand how users who share the same properties compare to users who do not share the same properties. And that is what we are exploring in today's video, how breakdowns work in Mixpanel Insights reports. This is especially important when you understand a general idea of how your users are using a feature or using a part of your product. But now you're curious. You're trying to understand how do different types of users stack up against one another. That's where breakdowns come in. As always, I'm going to be sharing an example. We're just using the social networking app that we've explored in the previous example, and also walking us through typical scenarios to explore how breakdowns work in Mixpanel. Let's get into it. By way of quick recap, Mixpanel Insights reports are based off of metrics, and metrics are events combined with how you choose to measure them. So for us to understand breakdowns, we have to start with those metrics. Let's start with the send message event, looking at the uniques. To keep it simple, we're looking at this social media or social networking app where users send messages to one another, and we're keeping it simple as measuring the unique messages that are sent on a daily basis in the past 6 months. We want to break this down further to understand unique patterns of behavior among different categories of users instead of having a general idea of their averages, of their uniques, of their totals. For us to explore the breakdown capability, we see it on the insights reports after we've selected our metric. Breakdowns are usually based off of properties. Those properties could be user properties, event properties, or cohorts of users that have been defined based on certain behaviors and properties as well. The first capability within the breakdown that I'll be showing us is how to break down this event based on user property. We also know so far that user properties are properties that define user profiles. They most often do not change because they are properties of users. But event properties are the properties that define details of the event as when it was fired. So most likely event properties fired by the same user could differ depending on when or where the event was fired from. To explore the breakdown by user properties, I would like us to look at a simple example of breaking down the send message uniques by a user property, which can be as easy as the plan. For example, this social app, people can be on different plans. So we want to see who are the people that are sending the most messages and what is the pattern of behavior among users on different plans with respect to sending messages. Now, if we select the user property plan, we're able to see in this table and in this chart, we're looking at the line chart in this case, that most users that are sending messages are on the free plan, followed by users that are on the month-to-month plan, then the annual plan, and the VIP plan. So that way we understand the uniques and the averages or the totals of users sending messages, but this is how they are distributed and broken down by the plans that users are on. This is also highly dependent on maybe more users are on the free plan, which is why more users are sending messages, and you have fewer users on the VIP plan, and then fewer users are sending messages on the VIP plan. That's also a possibility. That is going to be corroborated by the information that we have about how many users are on each plan. We can see it clearly now. We're getting more information about users and their properties and breaking it down to understand the patterns of behavior on an event. Like I mentioned, user properties hardly ever change. I should also be clear that there is a very distinct way to understand what is a user property and an event property. An easy way is to click the user and you see all the user property, and click the event, you see the event property. But a very telltale sign is most times the user property is always prefixed by user and then the property, so that you know you're selecting a user property, not an event property. So that's one way to understand breakdown, using it to understand patterns of behavior of users that share similar user property. The next way that I want us to look at breakdowns, which you may already have guessed, is looking at breakdown by event properties. These are the properties that are associated with the event when the user fired the event, irrespective of the user property. This time around, for the event property, I want us to look at the property of the operating system. If users can access this social networking app on their mobile phone, they can access it on their computer, they can access it on multiple devices. We want to see most times when users are doing the send message, what is the operating system that they are using to help us understand the kinds of devices that they are using. Operating system in this case is associated with the event because every time a user triggers this event, they are on one device or another. So when we break down by the operating system, we can see that the Windows and the Mac-based operating system are really close, with the Mac-based operating system just slightly higher, and then the Linux operating system trailing slightly closer to that. And this also helps us understand that, a lot of our users are actually most likely going to be sending messages on an Android device. So maybe when we're improving capabilities of the send message, we should have the Android users in mind or top of mind compared to the users on Linux operating system. We can also see a pattern of behavior that the users on mobile-based operating systems seem to trend higher, while the users on desktop-based operating system are trailing behind. Again, this lets us know that 1,000 and whatever users are sending message, but most likely a lot of them are going to be on either an Android and iOS based device. And if we optimize for that number, then we are most likely going to capture a higher percentage of our users, and a lower percentage can be dealt with much later. That's what this chart tells us. Looking at the numbers as well, you can see that even on a month-on-month basis, the different segments that we've broken down into are trailing in the same pattern. So we don't have a month where suddenly Linux-based users are spiking higher. The pattern of the graphs for each segment seems to trail in the same pattern. So there are no outliers or anomaly. If there is, then you can investigate and say, hey, what suddenly happened that the Linux-based users are higher than the Windows or OS X-based users? That way you can also drive some more investigation. But this is also why I say you start to look at breakdowns when you're now curious into more investigative understanding of user behavior within your product. It's also important to look at the table below the chart, not just looking at the chart itself. If anything, sometimes I actually just collapse the entire chart and look at the table by itself for me to better understand the raw numbers, to say, okay, about 4,000 plus users are Android, 3,000 plus on iOS, and the remaining about 1,900, 1,400, that's about half of the iOS users. So the 4,000 and 3,000 is about 70 to 80% of my users. So sometimes the numbers themselves should make more sense to us versus just looking at the charts to understand the trends and the patterns of behavior. So that's something I find really helpful as well. The third way which breakdowns work is looking at users as a cohort. I have a video on user cohorts, which I'll also link in the description below. But cohorts are groups of users that we've categorized together based off of different properties. So instead of identifying specific user or event properties that you're interested in breaking down by, you can actually create a cohort of users that match a certain number of criteria that you are interested in, and then break down by that cohort so you can see how those users in that cohort trend compared to users that don't belong within that cohort. If you go within the cohort, you can see your power users. We've defined our cohort of power users based on the certain number of criteria within this product. So for you to use the breakdown by cohort, you must have defined your cohort, or at least be interested in defining your cohort here, which Mixpanel allows you to. But if you have your cohorts defined, if I want to break down by power users, I only just have to select the cohort of power users and then see how that cohort trends in comparison to users that are not in that cohort, which we can see on the chart here. So my power users are represented by the turquoise looking line, and my users that are not in the power user category are represented by the orange line, which is higher, and then my all user profiles, which you can also toggle off here so you don't get distracted. This helps you to understand that my power users are using the send message capability this way, while my not power users are using it this way. The understanding here can also be that I have more users that are not power users, so there's a likelihood that the users that are not power users are going to be higher with their uniques. It's also important to know that even though our power users in this case average less than the users that are not power users when we're looking at the uniques, possibly because we have fewer power users but very engaged. If we change this metric and we're looking at it on a weekly basis, and also change our measure to look at the frequency per use, which we would expect power users to use the send message more frequently on average. So if we're looking at the frequency per use of users as an average and still keeping that cohort, you will notice that our power users, who are now in purple, by the way, now trend way higher compared to users that are not power users, even though we have more users that are not power users within these products. And so our understanding of the fact that power users, they may be small but are highly engaged, makes us see that if we're looking at this send message feature as an average frequency per user, we expect that our power users are going to trend upwards compared to users that are not power users. And that's one of the things that we need to factor in, or the nuances that we need to have in mind when we're looking at metrics. We have fewer power users but highly engaged power users. So if we're looking at their frequency per use, there's a likelihood that power users are going to use the app more frequently compared to users that are not power users, which we can see from the averages here. Our power users are using the app on an average of 2.9 times within the past 6 months, and our not power users are using it on average of 1.9 times in the past 6 months, even though as uniques, we have way more users that are not power users. And so this is how switching metrics helps us to have better understanding of user behaviors. So it's not just totals that are important. This is where averages are also important. This is where cohorts are important. And breaking down by cohorts or breaking down by user properties helps you to play around with metrics, to not just stick to totals or simple metrics, but understand nuances of user behavior. So a quick recap before I go into the next set of behaviors with breakdowns. We've talked about breakdowns being ways to understand how your users that fit into different properties are using a particular event or engaging with your products. You can break down by event properties, you can break down by user properties, and you can also break down by cohorts, which are users that fit into a category that you've defined based on properties. I've also mentioned that an understanding of the way your users are behaving and the events can help you tweak the measures of your event to better engage with the breakdowns in a way that makes sense to you and your products. So now I'm going to show us 2 different ways in which you can tweak your breakdowns that will also help you have a different perspective to how you are breaking down. And so now that we're still looking at the send message event as a unique measure, I want to show us how we can understand breaking down numeric property into buckets that are understandable. And so if it so happens that the property that we're breaking down by, in this case, an event property, is a numeric property, for example, message size in words. By default, Mixpanel buckets numeric properties, but you can go into the 3 dots here to decide how you want to customize your buckets. So message size in words here. Now, if I'm looking at the table alone by itself, 0.4K to 0.5K, 0.3K to 0.4K, all of these numbers may not actually make sense to you, especially if your users are sending messages with 0 to maybe 1,000 words. These breakdowns by default do not really make sense. And so you can go in to customize how your numeric properties can be broken down. And so customizing your bucket requires you to first select the numeric property by which you want to break down, and then customize your bucket. And so here I can customize my bucket by the default Mixpanel is using here is every 100 numeric values, but I can customize it by 10 so that it ranges from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. I can customize it by bucket size of 5, so it goes from 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. I can customize it by a bucket of 20. Whatever bucket makes sense for my understanding, I can customize the buckets for the numeric properties. And so let's say we go with the bucket size of 10. So if we apply this, you would notice that the table stops being 0.4k to 0.5k. Now you have reasonable buckets that you can also sort from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. And this makes more sense to say, okay, a lot of users are sending messages that range from 0 to maybe 1,000 to 1,000 words, and so it's more relatable. And so when you're looking at your charts, you can still see that, okay, some of the buckets are clustered together, and the bucket cluster of 0 to 10 is really high up there. So maybe I should change and customize my buckets in such a way that it's relatable. So I can go in there, customize my bucket again, and say, you know what, maybe 0 to 5, and I'm only looking at a maximum. You can also indicate a maximum in the bucket that I'm looking at 0 to 5, 5 to 10 in increments of 5. And so if you apply that, you are able to see that, okay, maybe a lot of users are in the 5 to 10 range, which is most people are sending 5 to 10 words. And so that starts to give you an idea of most of my words fall within the 5 to 10 range. This is where you now start to think about customizing your bucket differently, or deciding on a maximum or deciding on a minimum. So now that we see that a lot of our messages averaging 224 falls within the 5 to 10 range, I might decide to customize the bucket and say, you know what, I'm only interested in a maximum of 30 words. Let's see how every of the buckets are operating. And so now we have a very realistic bucket that tells us the 5 to 10 range being the highest. Most of the above 30, we'll worry about that later, but now we're looking at the 5 to 10 range. If you're still curious, you can still further customize these buckets to a bucket size of 2 if we're really like getting into it. And you see that customizing to a bucket size of 2 means that most people fall within the 4 to 6 range. So 5 to 10 is a broader range, but narrowing down, we're now within the 4 to 6. So this is a way for us to use buckets to customize numeric properties that we're breaking down by for us to understand. And again, this is useful for product decisions. Like on average, people are sending very short bursts of words in their messages. They are not sending long paragraphs. Each message that is sent is maybe, hi, how are you? How are you doing? Gotcha, I'll be there. Okay, see you soon. Those are, so you understand the patterns of use of how your users are interacting with this feature, and make decisions to say, if users are sending short bursts of message, maybe it's important for us to actually even preload some of the messages that they will send so that they don't need to type. They just select and it goes through. Whatever innovation you want to do, this is how you use data to inform those decisions. And so this is how you use buckets to customize the numeric properties that you're breaking down by. Your customization can also, it doesn't have to be evenly distributed bucket sizes. It can also be different bucket sizes. So in this case, maybe I start from 0, I want the next to be 2, I want the next to be 5, I want the next to be 15, and I want the next to be 30. So my bucket sizes are not even. In this case, I have 0 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 15, 30, and then 100. So that way I can customize my bucket. And you see the values here. If you apply it, it applies the same varied bucket sizes that you've selected. So that's another way of using varied bucket sizes. And of course, there's a last category where you can decide not to use any buckets, and it gives you the messages as a numeric value. And again, by looking at the numeric value without understanding the bucket size, we can see that a lot of the messages are 5-worded messages, which is the highest we have here. And so these are the ways in which understanding the bucket sizes can help us to understand groups and categories, but also just seeing the numeric value straight up the way it is and see where most of our numeric property values lie. That's how to manage and manipulate your numeric properties so that it's not an overwhelming gibberish number. You can always back out the 5, which is the highest, to see how the other numbers are trending. If I remove the 5, I see that every other numeric property value can shine, and I can see where things lie. I can remove the zeros, blanks, I can remove the ones. You can select or deselect to your heart's content to see what you want to understand. So this is how to use buckets for numeric property breakdown. The last way which I want to show us how to customize our breakdown is quite similar to buckets, but for non-numeric. And the example I want us to see in this case is also for send message, but what if we're breaking down by the operating system? Initially, I showed us how we would break down by operating system and see where everybody falls. But what if I actually have so many operating systems and I'm just trying to understand mobile and desktop operating system? The bigger question I'm trying to answer is who is on mobile, who is on desktop? But I don't have mobile and desktop as properties, because this rightly gives us a breakdown of Android, iOS, OS X, Windows, and Linux. So this is one of the ways in which you can meander through with properties that you have to get information that you want. So what you can do is to use buckets to group mobile and desktop based on what you know. If I decide to customize my buckets, I can say I want the Android and the iOS to be a bucket, which I can call mobile, and then I want the Linux, the OS X, and the Windows to be another bucket, and I will apply that. So once I apply that, I see Android and iOS, Linux, OS X, and Windows as a separate bucket. And so instead of having the 5 as a list, I've already put them into buckets of 2 are here, 3 are here. So now you can see that when we group our buckets this way, we can see that mobile, while it is higher than the desktop operating system, the difference is not that significant, at least in my opinion, compared to when we had the Linux as 1300 and Android as 4000. And so using buckets also helps you to make the right decisions. Even though we said, oh, we'll optimize for the Android and iOS, we can clearly tell that desktop users are not trailing too far behind. I mean, 1400 compared to 2000, it's not too far behind. It's about 30% more. And so even if we're overemphasizing on a mobile experience, we still have a significant number of users that are going to be using this capability on desktop. And so we shouldn't just leverage the information that we had from the raw data. Breaking it down and grouping them into buckets now tells us, you know what, you need to still pay attention to the desktop users a lot more. And so this is where breakdowns and buckets help. The breakdown helps you understand how users are distributed, but you can bucket them to actually understand better how the groups of breakdowns work. This example suffices for one, grouping similar properties to understand better how patterns of user behavior trends for those properties, but also as a proxy when you don't have a property that you need and several other properties could be adjacent to the property that you need, then you can just put them into a bucket and of course explain to your team to understand the way you've arrived at some of the decision, even though you don't have the actual data that you need. In this case, we don't have desktop and mobile as properties, so we use the operating system and grouped them to represent desktop and mobile. One more bonus point that I want to share with us when it comes to working with breakdown is around data types. Data types are an easy way to also, one, use proxy information, but also look at your breakdown differently. If we're still looking at the send message event measured as Unix, if I decide to break down by the user property age, age in this case is a numeric value within Mixpanel because it comes in as a number that represents the age of the user at the time they sign up for our app. But we can also just change the property to be a string instead of a number, depending on how we want to use the data. So if we make it a string, it just appears as a string instead of it being a numeric value that is grouped into buckets. And if you decide to then customize the buckets for your age, your buckets can now appear as strings. So maybe you want every age that ends in 0. So I can have 10, I can have 20, I can have 30, and I can have 40 as one bucket and everybody else separately. In this way, I see everybody that is in a 10-based age number. However, that is useful for your analytics. So I had to convert the age into a string, first of all, so that I could select the specific values that I was interested in putting into a bucket. So the difference here is that age being a numeric value, if I left it as a number in the first place, my bucket will be automatically generated based on the numeric value. So my buckets could only be customized as numbers, even varied or none. But I had to change it into a string first of all, so that I would then be able to use buckets that would allow me to select the specific ages that I wanted. If I wanted every age that ended in 5, I just had to select 5, 15, 25, 35, and that's it. And everybody else is seen as a different bucket. That's the way in which changing the data type of a numeric value can help you to select the specific values that you want to put in a bucket, so that it doesn't treat it as a numeric bucket data type. I hope that helps, and I hope that clarifies. But the way in which this comes across in an example is if you're looking for people with specific ages within your product that don't fall within sequential ranges, then you can convert the numeric data type into a string and select the specific ages that you're interested in. Put them in a bucket and you see what they're doing. So those are the ways in which you can manipulate your data type for you to be able to customize your breakdown in a way that works for you. So far so good. I've shown you a lot of things around breakdowns, which helps you to deep dive and investigate into different user properties and how they trend against one another within your product or the feature that you're interested in. I've shown you how the breakdown can work with user properties, with event properties, with cohorts, and how to start to bucket your breakdowns for numeric values and non-numeric values in a way that helps you make better product decisions depending on the questions that you have. So I hope this has been helpful to you. As always, I'll be looking out for your comments, your questions, your feedback. And if there are any areas that are unclear, I'll be happy to do a follow-up video to provide some more clarity. If this video has been helpful to you, share with your product manager friends, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.